Today we're at Delmark Records at Riverside Studios with Delmark's manager and chief recording engineer Steve Wagner. How
Hi.
you doing, Steve?
Fine. How you doing?
All right. We've
Good.
worked together for many years, since 1990 at Delmark, and we're in the control room here in front of the Neotech board. How long have you been in the studio?
Back in 1992, Delmark built the studio that we're in right now. Most of the equipment, the core of the equipment that we obtained came out of a studio called PS Studio, which was Paul Serrano's studio, which was down in the McCormick Place area. He had just lost his building to the McCormick Place expansion. And so he had to move, and he felt he was at an age where he didn't really want to oversee the beginning of wiring a whole new studio. And so we had done some projects at his studio. And Bob Kester, the owner of Delmark, who has kind of a good historical oversight of music companies and record companies that have had their own their own studio, thought to himself, wow, maybe we could have our own studio. And so at that point they kind of hatched a deal together where we would buy all the equipment. And that was in '92, and the deal was hatched, and so we brought all the equipment in here. And so we had just previously bought the building in the year before '91. At that time, this was just one big open warehouse, and the room that we're in really was not a room at that time. This control room and studio was designed by Paul and Malcolm Chisholm, and we built it, and here we are 18 years later.
Now, there's a name with some history in the Chicago blues scene and music scene, Malcolm Chisholm. Could you talk about him for a minute?
Well, I don't really know a lot about him other than he was the main engineer at Chess Records in their later years. And in his later career, after Chess had folded, he taught at Columbia, sound recording. Other than that, you'll have to kind of Google him to find out some more. I know he's kind of a legendary guy, and he had a very strong personality, as do many people in the recording industry. Yeah. A lot of know-it-alls, but, you know, maybe sometimes for good reason.
Yeah, I've met some of his students who studied engineering with him at Columbia. So would you say it's pretty rare for a label to own their own studio?
I don't know. I mean, the whole concept of what a record company is so changing these days. I'm not even sure what a record company is anymore, almost. I've heard that like Universal and other big labels are so downsized from the way they used to be, and they just don't operate in the same way that they do anymore. In terms of blues labels, I think most labels don't have their own studio. You know, but you'll find more and more, like as the technology goes on, and you've seen like where a lot of people have home studios and a lot of real studios have folded because of that. There are a lot of smaller labels who are operating like that. Case in point, like Nick Moss is doing his own label, and he has some kind of his own studio. I'm not sure if he's doing his own records in his own studio, but I know he has a studio, and there's probably a lot of other people out there like that too. You know, it's a way to do stuff less expensively, and now with the electronics, you know, the technology getting to the point where it is, you can have decent recording stuff for pretty cheap.
So how many blues records would you say Delmark has averaged over the years since this studio opened?
Well, you know, music trends come and go, and there's peaks and valleys, and there was a big, huge blues peak in the late '90s. A lot of people buying a lot of blues CDs, and because you're selling more, there's more income, and therefore you're encouraged to have more activity. And at that point in time, we were recording something like maybe 15 new projects in a calendar year on the blues side. Remember, Delmark is jazz and blues, and so I'm just saying blues. We probably did closer to 20 to 30 albums of new recordings in a calendar year in the late '90s, but it was split between jazz and blues. And additionally, at that point, we hadn't even fully put all of our LP catalog out on CD, and so we were still doing some conversions at that point. So you would announce those as new releases too. So between the new recordings and the reissues, we were doing somewhere between 30 and 40 packages a year.
And you were involved in many of those as both an engineer and producer?
Yes.
That's quite a workload.
Yeah, it is. And I have to see all the art direction too.
Right.
The photographers, the illustrators, the graphic designers, the liner note writers.
Wow.
And the mixing and the engineering and the producing. You know,
Mhm.
Bob wasn't very active in the studio in the late 90s. I
Right.
think for a period of maybe 5 or 7 years, I don't even think he was at a blues recording session.
Yeah, I rarely remember him at mine.
And
Maybe
so,
sticking his head in.
You know, I was doing all of that.
Right.
In
So
addition to other stuff.
So let's start with some recording questions, because I know when you guys first opened up, you were recording analog.
That's correct.
And when did you first talk a little about your analog equipment? I know you have some stuff here that's from the Chess Studios that's pretty fascinating. And talk about the early days recording analog.
Well, we have a lot of machines in this room and in the building. It's almost like a history of recorded music. We have tape machines. We have a machine out in our hallway right now that's a mono machine, like they did back in the 50s. It came out of Chess Studio. It was on loan to the Experience Museum in Seattle. And we're actually looking at bringing it back up to speed now. We just recently had it looked at to see what work needs to be done on it. And so somewhere down the line, we'll probably remaster our mono recordings played on an actual mono machine of that era. And then eventually they went to stereo, and we have some of those around here too. Yeah. There's a Scully right there to my right, a 280B. It's a great machine.
When was that from, approximately?
That's from the 70s. And those preamplifier sections can be used as microphone preamplifiers. You can just plug like a ribbon microphone into the back of that and go right into the computer, and you're recording.
Wow.
And it sounds really great too.
So a machine like this will get along and function well with a computer? Yeah,
you just patch it in and you're recording right into the computer. That's how I do a lot of our masters when I play back. Like we're currently in putting a new package out of Magic Sam, West Side Soul. And for the first time, we're reverting back to the original 1967 analog mix. And so I just played it on that machine right there, recorded it right into the computer at the highest sampling rate available, and mastered it from there.
Wow.
We also have a 1/2-inch machine that's a 3-track and a 4-track machine. The very earliest multi-track recordings were a 3-track, not a 4-track. One of our masters is a 3-track, Roscoe Mitchell Sound, the very first AACM record. And we have a machine you can play it back on, which is pretty amazing because there's not that many out there. And that's when they got into multi-tracks, like 1966. That was the first time that people started using more than 2 channels to record on at the time.
Really?
And then from there it went to a 1-inch 8-track. And if you look to your right there, that's a Scully 1-inch 8-track machine. That machine came out of Chess Studio and probably was the machine used to record all of their really late records just before they went out of business, including Electric Mud was probably recorded on that machine. And the other Howlin' Wolf one, Howlin' Wolf Hates This Album or whatever, that was probably recorded on that machine. And anything else in that era of the late 60s was probably done on that machine right there. And those 8 channels also are individual microphone preamplifier sections where you can, again, use those as microphone preamplifiers. Sometimes when I feel energetic and I'm doing a jazz session, I'll wheel it over and plug a trumpet into it using an RCA ribbon microphone and use it as a preamplifier. So that's a nice machine. Then it went to 2-inch from there eventually, which was like sometime in the 1970s. About 75 or 76 was when the 2-inch really kind of came on. We have a 2-inch machine behind me over there. It's a 2-inch MCI machine. And so when we moved here, that was the main way we were recording at the time, using that 2-inch machine right over there. And it was a lot of fun, you know, but you had to be very careful. Because you couldn't prescribe what your punching would be. You had to manually punch it in. And so I remember doing some overdub sessions that were pretty challenging. I remember Syl Johnson punching in syllables.
Really?
And you had to get in and out before the next word. And I remember I did a session with Bonnie Lee, And she was having this one little problem, and we must have tried it 100 times. And on the 100th time, I think she got it, and I almost cried. Actually, I think I did cry a little bit.
Yeah. So you were manually in front of the tape machine.
Well, there's a remote control, so I'm sitting here, but every time you try, you have to rewind to the spot, start it again, and press red in the exact spot you want to press red at. You know, now with the computer, you can just tell it right at this spot here, punch in, and it does it, of course.
Right.
But back in those days, you couldn't do it, so it was pretty challenging.
Have you seen a big change in mics, in mic technology over the years? Do you use mainly vintage mics?
Well, some of the more fancy microphones, vintage kind of stuff, I use more in our jazz recordings. For blues recordings, I don't use as much stuff. For electric guitar, electric bass.
Right.
I have my favorite mics for that kind of stuff.
Right.
Like for guitar amplifier, these days my favorite mic to use is a Beyer M88. It's a nice microphone. I think it's a little nicer than a Shure 57. I mean, they're both good. I even use a Shure SM7 sometimes when I'm in a pinch, if I'm using all my Beyer M88s for something else, or I want to, it depends. But I like that microphone a lot. I also typically use a large condenser microphone in the front also, next to the Beyer M88, typically like a Neumann U87. And then we mic the back of the amplifier. Again, I might use a Beyer M88, something like that. And then I also use a FAR microphone. A lot of times I use our bathroom as isolation booth. I had the bathroom wired. So I have cables that run from the studio to the bathroom, so you don't have to run cables.
Right.
But we have a bathroom. It's probably something like 8 by 12 or something like that. So typically I'll have the FAR mic. It could be, it depends what I'm trying to go for. It might be 4 feet. It might be 8 to 10 feet. It depends what kind of distance I'm looking for that particular session. Usually I use some kind of condenser mic for that microphone. Either maybe a Neumann U47 FET, or another one is a KM86 is a nice microphone also.
And using the bathrooms helps with some of the reverb?
Well, you have a controlled sound. I've actually put some soundboard up in there
Really?
to try to control the reflection of the sound and how much it bounces. And so I think I've got a good formula going in there right now. And of course you get the complete isolation.
Yeah.
So that means if the guitar player wants to overdub his part or fix some little something in there, you don't have to worry about it bleeding into the other instruments in the studio, like the pianos.
And the alleys get a lot of use during recording sessions, I'd imagine. As well. Yes. So,
yeah, and then in '96, you were asking me about switching to digital recording. Back in '96, we bought a digital tape machine for the first time. And so we started using digital tape. And it might not have been quite as nice and warm exactly as the analog tape, but there were a lot of benefits to it. It was way cheaper